Welcome to the Lazy Fluency podcast, where we have casual conversations switching between English and Japanese so that you can learn from and with us along the way. I'm Joey.
And I'm Yami.
And the topic of the day is masculinity. Before we get into that, make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and or drop a review on whatever platform you're listening on. We appreciate the support. And with that out of the way, masculinity. So recently on social media, and I guess legally Romania, one of the most popular, I'd say, male influencers of recent history in at least American or Western media, Andrew Tate, was arrested for sex trafficking. But one of the interesting things about this is this is the second time this has happened for this person as well, is that this person is one of the most popular, as I said, social media influencers, specifically towards young men in America at the moment, which I find atrocious. Because of that, I feel like this is a good episode to talk about masculinity, specifically Asian masculinity or the perceptions of it. And so we've kind of we have a few different, obviously, perspectives on masculinity from like the Japanese side, from a like sociological perspective, as well as like my personal experiences and Imi's personal experiences. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today. What does it mean to be masculine, specifically in Japan?
個人的なのも入れるの?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I'm going to start with. What do you think it means to be masculine in Japan? And I can contrast that what I think it means masculine in America specifically.
なんかまずその日本でなんていうの、男らしさっていうのが捉えられてるのかっていう統計アンケートみたいなのの結果があって、でまあ一番上に来たのが頼りがいがあるとかたくましい強い、まあ、要するになんだろう、女の人がついていきたいような感じ。
Is this data from the 2012 paper that we're talking about?
そう、2012年だから、まあ今ちょっとだけ変わってるかもしれないけど、まあ大体は変わらないのかな。
What are the other ones for the most frequent characteristics?
今、多分令和で取ったやつは全体的に優しいっていう、性格を持った人が男らしいって捉えられてるらしい。
So this is 2019. This is a 2019 survey compared to a 2012 survey. At least Dewa Ginzai, so it has to be 2019 forward, right? Dewa was 2019, I believe. So there's the first survey is a 2012. I think 800. How many people were asked? Did you check? I think it was 800 something.
ね、何人かはまだちょっとごめん しっかりとは何人に聞いたのかはちゃんと調べられてないけど、まあ
I believe that one was 800 something different participants were asked and of different age ranges. So in 2012, a lot of, I would say, at least modern day traditional masculinity, because as we'll go into masculinity, the only three consistent things I've been able to see with masculinity is things that aren't specifically tied to any sort of action, but traits that are tied more closely to the sex. So with like evolutionary psychology, or I guess biology in general, the main difference tends to be actions that stem from like the like psychological average differences and things that come as a consequence of having basically higher testosterone. So aggressiveness, competitiveness, and physicality tend to be three traits that influence how masculinity ends up being actuated on in the real world. And the reason I'm separating that from, for example, having, let's say a provider or something like that is, historically speaking, depending on where you're looking at in humanity, like men being providers and women being supporters for like the children, whatever, has actually not been consistent. And like hunter-gatherer, I mean, not going whole separate societies, but in other versions of society, the roles have been different or more equal in terms of people getting food for their children. Like when hunter-gatherers, where women had a large role of getting food for their children or whatever, as opposed to like the perception of at least maybe 50 years ago, where men are the ones who get income so that they can provide in the form of food or whatever, housing. This is to say, anyways, with the Japanese perception from 2012 seemed pretty aligned with, I think, the Western ones, where the at least older Western, I'd say like 50 years ago, perceptions of men, where men are the providers. They whatever protect women, or at least stronger, able to do so, and they should also have. Did this one have any monetary thing? Should they be wealthy? What was the perception of this the 2012 survey?
というと
As in having money, like 経済的に。
経済力があるのも男性男らしさに入ってて、まあでも違うアンケートだと昔と今の男らしさでイメージが変わりましたかっていうアンケートでは、まあ半分ぐらいの人が昔の男らしさと今の男らしさは、違うって答えてるから、まあ多分社会的ななんていうの、その状況によってもね、によって変わったんじゃないかっていうのが、まあ私たちの考え。
Yeah.
そう。国が豊かになるとね、それだけなんか。
And was that also in the 2012 survey, even in 2012?
これは最近、令和の方。
Okay, 令和の方。And so over 50% differentiated the definition of masculinity between just one generation. So like there's and can you go again to the traits that were most described by what it means to be masculine in the 2019 survey, not the 2012 one? Yeah, here we go. So I mean, you can read it if you want. So and through the generation, because I think that's interesting.
まあでも20代30代40代とあって、まあこれちょっとまあもう少しね上の年代をアンケート取ってないのがちょっとね良くないとは思うけど、まあ20代30代40代っていうところでアンケートを取っていて、まあどの世代でも優しいっていうのが1位になってると。で、次に力強いとか、まあ実行力があるとかねっていうのが次に来てて、でも全体的には優しい、力強い、頼りになる、堂々としてる、包容力。まあ2位から5位はまあ昔で言う男らしさなのかな。で優しいがもう一番それを越して一番トップになったっていうのがまあ今変わったこと。
Wait, is this 包容 Wait, where is this? 包容力? Is that inclusiveness? Am I misunderstanding?
そうなんていうの？まあ相手を認めるとか、なんていうんだろう。優しさに入るのかな。
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, so that's the 2019 survey from Dewa, and you can see just within like 7 years, at the very least 7 years, because it would start from Dewa. There's already a big shift into number one, where kindness is number one. But there's another thing I kind of want to talk about here, where these are like the personality traits, and obviously talked about some physicality. But there's always an interesting part about masculinity as what you say, and masculinity as it's perceived by other culture when you get cross-cultural. So my point is, like, when you say something like being strong or something like that, my question is that common is, what does that actually mean? You know what I'm talking about in terms of what kind of physical characteristics, or like how buff? Because like America, we're also going more and more, I'd say, like our version of ideal masculinity or ideal physicality is getting less and less, I'd say, extreme. So like in the 80s, or even like through, say, 60s all the way like through 90s, weightlifting was really a big deal. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger and stuff like that, the Terminator, the very big body set. And you actually, even in Japanese anime, this is a trend as well. If you look at 90s anime or 80s and 90s anime, and you compare them to even like probably say late 2000s to even like modern day anime, everybody's gotten less bulky. You would say, what in Japanese, hosomacho?
そう、細マッチョの定義もなんか男と女で違ったり、あと日本と海外でも違うんだよね。まあ日本の細マッチョの定義で言うと、男側からしたらまあなんて言うんだろう、なんだっけな、ボクサーみたいな感じで、だけどもうちょっと脂肪が少ないのが男からした細マッチョ。でも女の人から、見た細マッチョっていうのはジャニーズみたいで、なんか痩せ、
explain what Johnnies are. I barely know what Johnnies are.
ジャニーズは男のアイドル。
It's kind of like a boy, their version of like One Direction. Except they always get renewed. Like every some amount of years, Johnny's becomes a new Johnny's with a new set of
だけど
men.
ジャニーズってもうなんかエージェンシーなのあれ。事務所だから。まあ全体のグループも、ジャニーズっていう会社の中にいろんなグループがいいんだけど、まあそれを置いといて、まあジャニーズっていうのは、歌手兼ダンサーみたいな感じで、で、まあ世の中の女性は細マッチョが好きっていう、確か7割ぐらいの人が細マッチョがいいって答えてるのかな。
So this is where I especially wanted to point out kind of one of the differences between the US and Japan is, so we also have boy bands as well. I don't think anybody in large, at least men in general, would consider those men masculine. They would be leaning more towards feminine, as in like maybe more makeup, less defined muscles, more emphasis on caring. This is actually a whole other topic that we get into, which is like what is desired from a man versus what is masculine. Kind of separate question. Like what is desired versus what is masculine. But like those types of people, I mean, think of your Justin Bieber, old school Justin Biebers, or like One Direction, all those. They're seen as being more caring, kind, and don't think is my opinion, but the demographic of these people is women. So they're catering to the desires of what women want from men. Where if you look at things that men are into, let's go like Shonen Jump, like Japanese style, like 1980s, 1990s, or even modern day, like some of my favorite like movies as a kid, like 300. So we're like a Spartan. It's like the Spartans movie, as these really buff Spartans. Where like men to men thing, I think you have more exaggerated like physical traits, more exaggerated, rigid, or more. I'm not going to say, it's hard to say what counts as traditional, but let's say traditional as defined within the last 300 years or something of men, where their roles are more clear, set. They're fighters, or they're more competitive or whatever. And that's targeted more towards men.
まあ絶対そのなんて言うんだろう、時代によっても男らしさっていうのはまあ概念が変わってきて、でメディアは絶対影響してるんだよ。多分昔はさ、男らしさはまあバオキーでマッスルみたいな感じっていうのが男らしさって宣伝されてたけど、今はさもう K-POP だったり、まあジャニーズだったりね、そういうのがまあ今人気だから。
But the thing is, does ninki mean there's otokorashi? That's kind of my question with this thing. Is like for like I think boy bands now have a much tighter hold over East Asia than they do in the US. Because of that, I feel like a lot of people or outside of Japan or East Asia think that every guy is like a K-pop dude, or we're wanting to dress like them, or something like that. I do feel like that's actually a significant, like, for example, even during the K-pop, boy band phase of the United States, I never felt that there was the average dude was trying to dress like the boy band people, if that makes sense. Whereas in Japan, I do feel like there's guys are actively trying to look like let's say wear makeup, have more like fashion, more interest in fashion and stuff like that to appeal or relate to the boy band. I feel like I'm basically saying I feel like there's a closer association between boy bands and men actually wanting to mimic those boy bands, even though boy bands are targeted towards women primarily. Does that make any sense?
まあ日本だってそうするとモテるって思ってるからみんな真似するんじゃない？
Well, I'm saying I don't believe that was as strong of a case with like American boy bands, at least through my lived experience. I'm not entirely sure if it didn't feel as much of a phenomenon where like almost all the clothing that you go into, I mean, this is a whole separate thing. So maybe I'll at least say that something else which is related to this is, do you think that, so back with the masculine versus, there's a difference between masculine and what's desired. So my question is, women might desire the specific, let's say the more 70% what you said, they like the modern version of the boy band guy. Do they think that is more masculine? And furthermore, do you think that there's a tendency to see other cultures as more or less masculine? For example, the average like Hispanic dude, the average American, the average like African American. I've seen interviews on the street before as well, and I mean, not to go into a whole separate thing about prejudice and whatever within Japanese perceptions, but I feel anytime you talk about anybody who has any color to their skin, there's like a positive and negative stereotype. They're buff, they're strong, they're great at athletics, they're masculine, but right behind that you have they're dangerous, they're not trustworthy, they're unruly. And so, do you know what I'm saying? Like, do you think that other countries' men are considered more masculine than Japanese men by Japanese people?
まあ少なくとも日本人のがやわで、まあ外国の人の方がまあ、生物学的にもさなんか体が大きくなりやすいじゃん。だからそっちのが強そうみたいなイメージはある。
Yeah, I mean, do you think that is correlated with them being viewed as more masculine? Because I have seen a lot of interviews that, I mean, like I said, I don't know if they're representative of all of Japan. But I mean, from my personal perspective, it definitely gives me the idea that it's weird. It's like a fantasy that in the perception kind of like that they're more masculine, and that's a lot of the times it's a positive thing. But at the end of the day, I don't feel like a lot of Japanese women actually want to be with, even if they perceive them to be superficially more masculine, it doesn't mean they actually want to date them or like marry a foreign man. Does that make sense? Like they can say, oh yeah, no, Western men are more masculine. That doesn't mean I want to date Western men, like the average Japanese woman. Do you know what I'm saying?
まあそこにはいろいろな要素が入ってくるんだけどさ、まあ言語のなんとかとかさ、言語の障害、壁とかさ、いろいろ。
Yeah. I'm trying, obviously, I believe that but I'm talking about them speaking in Japanese, not English. I'm saying when talking about, there are a lot of interviews on this, like Western men, do you want to date Western men? And then Western men means white men. But if they have like, do you want to date Western men? They'll show a black dude or whatever. And a lot of times to avoid being overtly racist, they'll be like, oh, they look tsuyoso or whatever, something like that. And I guess the question I'm trying to get at is, do you think like masculinity is seen as a positive thing in Japan?
難しいね。
Right, whether or not men are masculine, my question is, do you think masculinity is, the idea of it is seen as positive?
まあそうじゃない？少なくともさ、日本の女の人がさ、例えば男の人になんか決めてもらいたいとか、なんていうの、後ろからついていきたい人が多いんだよ、女の人は。
Has any notion of something called toxic masculinity made it so? Have you heard of this term before? Toxic masculinity?
勘違いした男らしさみたいな。
It depends on how you want to say it. So, some people would say that masculinity in itself is toxic. Therefore, toxic masculinity can mean, and I do believe a lot of people act this way. So, masculinity in any form that is not like a very narrow set of expectations is in itself toxic. And then there's another perspective, which is no, masculinity is very positive, but a lot of it is toxic. And then there's another perspective, like I said, the first perspective, which is because masculinity and like the whole society in this argument is constructed by men in a patriarchy, which maybe you've heard the term before. Because of that, all masculine expression has there's an inherently toxic portion to it. But
押し付けられるみたいな感じか。
Yeah, it's more of like I guess I was saying like that because it's very like the view of society as a strict like patriarchy created by men and for men as a thing. Masculinity itself in the West, I would say, is kind of viewed in a negative way. So if you express at least that it is very common to do so, if that makes sense. So regardless of the specific action, if you are looking or acting like you're asserting something that's traditionally masculine, let's say being hyper competitive, that could be construed as being negative because it could be, I don't know, you could cause fights, you could push somebody else out of a group if somebody's overly competitive. I have this problem where I own, like through growing up, I've done about I think 11 or 12 different sports in clubs or college and different like all competitive settings. And so anytime I casually play sports with any of my friends, I'm too competitive. Therefore, I don't really tend to do that for fun. And so when people can be hyper competitive, they can push people out, and that can be seen as like, oh, you're being toxic masculine. There's also other stuff that is more blatantly, you could say, toxic. Like we went over earlier, like the notions of like man spreading or in our previous episode, if you remember that. I'm just trying to ask, do you think that actually masculinity in itself is, so you don't think masculinity in itself is negative, or do you think
女の人にとってはある程度その求めてると思う。その相手の、相手が男の人の場合だった場合はね。だってなんでかっていうと、ついていきたいとか頼りにしたいとかあるから。だけどそのなんて言うんだろう、例えばあまりにも競争心が強い人だとさ、なんか嫌だよね。
Well, yeah, because I think there's an interesting thing there where a lot of so let's go aggression, competitiveness, physicality. I personally don't think those things are valued in Japanese society. Aggressive.
アグレッシブは絶対嫌われると思う。なんでかっていうと、もうどちらかというともう暴力とかにつながっちゃうからさ、DV とかね。
Well, it can, but it also can mean like you're very 積極的, very
proactive. Protective とかね。
Yeah, I mean, there are, like I said, there are ups and downsides almost any trait.
だからもうこれは全てのことはさ、あれじゃない。moderate じゃないとって感じじゃない。
I mean, it depends. It depends if you want to get something done. I'm saying like Olympians aren't moderately training. Like that competitiveness, that the reason hyper competitiveness can be used in very effective ways, I feel like as well. But there's something that I want to touch on before we finish this section and make sure, which is the very last article, or I guess this is a study that looks over, or I guess a 2019 report. I'm trying to get to it here, called Evolved but Not Fixed: A Life History Account of Gender Roles and Gender Equality. In a evolutionary psychology journal that was in 2019 by Nanzu and Li Chang. And the reason I chose this article is I found it was, one, very informative. It covers a large history of research covering what gender roles have, how they've expressed themselves for men and women, and also compared that in terms of like basically equality, the roles of society. And this argument that is trying to be made in this paper, which I mean I do think is at least compelling to some degree, is that here, I think I'll put the image on screen right now, and it categorizes basically how gender roles tend to express themselves, as well as how inequality between men and women tends to express itself in different types of societies. So they have something known as risk factors, extrinsic risks, and they have a notion of social competition. Social competition is when the more basically humanized or complex a human society gets, to differentiate yourself from others and compete for resources, the more abstract resources, the more individual, let's say, resources are needed to raise a child or make that child succeed. So the more that is the case, the higher socially competitive a society is.
これアジアは高いよね、中国。
Everywhere I think in modern society would be considered high, but it gets higher in other places. So, and then the other aspect of that is the extrinsic risks. So these aren't just like, obviously, very basic food, shelter, water. Other things like that, or maybe not in the present, it's not very risky, but there's a perception that there's going to be a lot of insecurity, or like, let's say like, I don't know, housing market crash or whatever, stuff like that. But obviously the more closer it does with like food, safety, shelter, those would be very high extrinsic risks. And so through this lens, there are 4 boxes, which is low extrinsic risks, low societal competition, which it is argued that in a society like this, you'll have present-oriented reproductive strategies. So if you have low risk and low competition, you will be more focused on the present in terms of like you're like having children, whatever. There'll be low social stratification, so not large disparity between like people in their social status. Mixed gender roles, so men and women sharing a similar gender role or more close gender roles, and then low gender inequality, so people will be more even. You have low so say high extrinsic risks, low societal competition, which is you'll have present-oriented reproductive strategies, low social stratification. So high risk, low social competition that'd probably be like very old societies, like when there's what's it called, agricultural. I can't remember. There's a word for it, where like berry gatherer societies. But anyways, traditional gender roles and low gender inequality. And then you have the last two ones, which are most close to our current society, which is or Japan, low extrinsic risks and high societal competition. So future-oriented reproductive strategies. What does this mean? So to have somebody succeed, let's say IME being a doctor, you need a lot of resources put into IME as a offspring or a child. Therefore, before having IME as a kid, like deciding to have IME or whatever, you need to most likely be older as a woman and a man, because you need more resources. And at the same time, because this society is more developed and it's more competitive, and both people need to be working to get resources, which means both people need to be independent. Both people need to also be able to take care of or participate in some extent to the child. And therefore, in a situation like Japan or like modern day Japan, as we saw, where gender roles are changing, it is more beneficial for both sexes to have some of the traditionally more feminine or masculine traits. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Yeah. And then that's where it says you get more modernized gender roles. So like, you know what I'm saying? If you need to put a lot of resources into a child, you're going to eventually need both parents getting income, which means you need both parents to be able to get income, which means you need both parents to be more independent, which means but you also need to take care of the child. And since both people are working, both people are probably going to need to have more nurturing side and nicer. So you kind of pull both, the genders become more, it says modernized, but mixed as well, is what this is arguing. And then you have the last one, which is high social competition and high extrinsic risks. I'd probably think that'd be more like modern day Africa or someplace like that. Like
social
Africa
was low social competition, the high extreme.
No, it depends where you're talking about. There's still some pretty developed, or maybe
Kenya とか.
Maybe this would be like the Philippines. Maybe actually would be a good example of this. Well, Philippines are hyper competitive, but they don't have any, there's a lot of insecurity in terms of.
そしたらフィリピンとかはハイハイじゃない?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I think Philippines might be a good example of high. So, and in this situation, you'd have people are focused around the present in terms of reproductive strategies. They want to have kids as many as possible. It's still like dominance-based societal stratification, which is saying it's competition. Competition is where you get everything done. It's all about being as competitive as possible. And this is arguing that tends to lead to more traditional gender roles, just as a consequence of men on average being more competitive, and leading to higher gender inequality. So inequality is different from roles, by the way. So inequality means that it's not a fair society to each one, if that makes any sense. Whereas roles means there are expectations for what someone should do.
アメリカはどこだと思う?
I think America's probably in the same. Oh, that's a really good. Okay, that's a really good question. So the question is, why is Andrew Tate so popular? And something that I find interesting is a lot of these risks, whatever, it's all in people's, obviously there is a real risk when people are not having food or whatever. But at the end of the day, humans are the ones to decide what is risky and what is not risky. So regardless of all the development I think America does have, there's a lot of perceived risk, whether it be, especially with our political system, where there's a lot of people, or especially conservative politicians, who are basically saying, people are trying to replace you. There's a whole replacement theory, especially with white men, and people are saying they're trying to get rid of men. Men aren't important or whatever. They're trying to rile people up, but they're saying the left is doing this to you and whatever. And because of that, I feel that could be seen as a extrinsic risk. And there are also actual places which do have high extrinsic risks, like in Chicago, in some locations where there's high crime, constant gun violence, food insecurity, police, stuff like that. So
いや日本でも本当に日本が low extrinsic で high
social competition
ではないんじゃない？だってさこれそうなるとさじゃあ low gender inequality になっちゃうじゃん。でも日本ってさ結構年寄りのさ、男の人が内閣とかもう結構男の人メインで。
Okay, well here's what you have to think about. Japan, literally what? World War II is still very recent, and very, very recent. And Japan, think of pre-war Japan to modern day Japan, and how fast that happened. That is insanely fast how much the
それ
country
そう
shifted.
したら他の国もそうならない。
Well, I'm saying that's kind of the point here is the development that Japan's been having and progressions has been crazy in the amount of time that it has. And even with your survey that you looked about, if you just look within 10-year differences, suddenly niceness is the most masculine trait. And so this isn't saying that this is what the society is now. This is saying what it will shift to become if it has all these things. And I do think Japan is probably shifting towards that way right now.
まあまあ、あれね、加速度的にはね、そうだね。
Like, because you have to look back, like, we're living in, like, a day at a time. But if you look at, like, you remove yourself and look historically, you're like, wow, Japan's actually developing really quickly. But yeah, anyways, hopefully you guys found this conversation interesting. 戻りました。
We are back.
今年の抱負について話したいと思います。
Resolution, right?
Yeah, New Year's resolutions.実は先週このことについて話した方がいいかもしれないんだけど。
Yeah, but we had a lot to talk about last time. So, yeah, we couldn't, make resolutions.
そう、交通機関の話になったから。でも今回は個人的な抱負について話したいと思うんだけど、同時にその日本では一番なんていうか人気の抱負は何だと思うの？
To be like better self.
その一般的にアメリカでは運動が一番人気。
Yeah, probably. Yeah. That's,
なんか痩せたいとか、
one of
強くなりたいとか。
resolutions that people have. Yeah.
で、あやみの。
For me, I think I'll be busier this year than last year. So I think, how do I say? I want to try something new that helps me become a better self. But at the same time, I want to have, how do I say, free time. So,
その目標は曖昧すぎるだと思わないの。私がなんか陸上やってた時だけど、その運動、リフト何でしたっけ？日本語で忘れたんだけど、lifting weights とか、その高校の時の思い出がある。そのなんか先生が、その先生が好きじゃなかったんだけど、一応こういうなんていうかアドバイスは良かったと思う。その目標を作る時には、その具体的じゃないと、その達成できるかどうか知らないから悪いということは、その客観的な目標がないと、ちょっと合格。
具体的な。
そう。
Let's say I want to learn how to edit like videos myself and wanna be creative.
でもそれも曖昧だと思う。なんかつまり、私の目標に関しては、書いてないけど、その毎日、いつも多分本とか漫画の話してるんだけど、実際はアニメ結構見るけど、本読むのが好きだけど、いつもなんか一日の終わりで、なんか本読んだ方がいいかもしれないけど、眠いから寝てしまう。それでだんだん時間が経つにつれると、なんか1ヶ月間が経っても全然読んでないことが多い。
I also want to read, but like when I start reading, I feel sleepy. like 5 seconds later. Yeah.
私もそう。でも私の具体的な今やろうとしてるのはなんか毎日30分ぐらい読むこと。で、陸上の頃からずっと毎日走ってるんだからそれを継続的にやるのが。
Yeah, wanna run every day. And for me, I want to get new information every day, like for 30 minutes. Yeah, like search on the internet or watch YouTube videos.
watch YouTube ビデオだったら私はなんか天才。それがゴールだったらすぐに合格できる。
like educational or like a documentary. Yeah.
そう。で、他の一番個人的にやりたいの、他の目標あるんだけど、でもその目標はちょっとこのポッドキャストと関係ないんだから、言わないけど、 今、ポッドキャストに関する目標、ポッドキャストというか、メインチャンネルに関する目標は、継続的に動画をアップロードすること、そのメインチャンネルで。今の問題は、実は5つとか6つの動画の、録音と撮影やってきたんだけど、なんていうか、私の一日の興味で、この動画作りたいからこの撮影するけど、その撮影したら、他の動画やりたいなと思うから、今の時点で動画1ヶ月間ぐらいアップロードしてないけど、実はなんか5つか6つの動画の撮影撮った。それで、目標はもっと継続的に動画アップロードするのが目標。
The problem is, you have too many, how do I say, ideas.
そう。
So you can't make everything at the same time.
そう。でも今、すごく、昨日、ネタバレしないけど、すごくいい発展があった。
Something good happened.
そう。その動画に関しては、面白い動画になると思うので、いつアップロードするかわからないんだけど、でも、とりあえずそれが私、全部の目標かな。日記も書こうとしてるんだけど、その最後のセクションについて話したいと思う。その日記のこと。その日本語、あまり、なんていうか、書く経験がないから、経験っていうか、機会がないから、その日記を書き始めることにした、その多分、今年でしたっけ？いや、去年だと思う。もちろん去年だった。今年じゃない。でも、それをなんか書き続けるのがちょっと難しい。でも、とりあえず、なんていうか、なんかどれぐらい漢字は大事かというとに関する質問があるから、多分他のセクションで答える。他の目標ある？今年の。
I think I will come up with a new resolutions as I experience this year. So, yeah, it's ongoing.
なんか、他の、本に関してはなんか1年でどのぐらいの本を完成すること。例えばなんか毎日ある程度本を読むこととか。
When I have time.
気が向いたら本を読むこと。
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
ほとんどの人のNew Year's Resolution はなんていうか現実叶わないというか、それで
現実味がない。
そう。現実味がないというよりも、その人がなんかできない、そのセットしてても、
不可能なね。
そう。
ありえないね。
いいや、ありえるけど、実現しない。それでそんなに悪いことではないかも。とりあえず、今年頑張ります。で、アミはあまり頑張らないとか。
頑張ります。
ある程度頑張る。
頑張ります。
And we're back with the final section.
ということは
？It means that you should send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com with a comment, question, language related and or otherwise, and give us a Apple Podcast review. It's been forever.
イメール、日本人から来てないよね、イメールは。
Yeah, we gotta get like a Japanese email. We've had some Japanese YouTube comments, but we gotta get an email at lazyfluency@gmail.com. Yeah. And this week we have a return of our MVP VIP commenter
戻ってまいりました。長い旅から。
And I'm responding to part of one of his comments. So he says, Travel Geek makes it look like food is really cheap in Japan. Maybe I'm just in a particularly expensive part of the US. But it's interesting to hear that you're seeing more expensive food in Japan versus the US. When I'm thinking, that's super cheap. I'm also not there. So maybe the channel is picking up particularly cheap food, or maybe my American dollar is worth less than your American dollar due to the location. I'd be interested to hear back on that topic because it's really looking conflicting. Maybe it's just the types of food that are cheaper are different. Like a $2 apple is a lot. But I've seen 400 yen and 500 yen curries, and they seem very cheap compared to a $15 to $18 curry over here. Yes, do you have thoughts on that? I would say, yes, it is the type of thing you want to buy that becomes expensive.
そう。なんだろう。その外食するのは安い方だと思う。なんでかっていうと、一つ目として、外食するのが安いプラスチップがないから。
Yeah, I love eating out in Japan. It is so awesome. Your full meal, like all price paid. I mean, we're not even, okay, we're going to say 100 yen is a dollar. Right now, that's not the case. So you get like a 30-40% discount basically on this. But even if that is the case and we say that like 100 yen is a dollar, you basically get full meals, lunch, and sometimes even dinner, $5 flat. No tax, or sorry, not no tax. No tip. That's it.
まあそうね。一般的にランチタイムだったらまあ500円から
You can even do 300. Like there's some like depends on how much you want to eat.
そうね。まあ平均的には500円からまあ高くて1500円かな。
Oh, that would be really expensive for lunch. For lunch, I think the average is like 500円 to like 1000.
違う、なんかフォーのなんか定食みたいな感じだと。
Still 1500 would be expensive.
平均としてはじゃあ1000円ぐらいにしとくか。
Yeah, for like, so $5 to $10 basically for like lunch per person. Whatever. Ramen. Like you can get ramen for like $6 to $7, like 600円、700円. I'd say other places maybe goes up to 800円. And then dinner, it goes like probably between $8 to $15, depending on what you want to get.
1000円からまあ多く見て2000円かな。
Yeah, if that would be really expensive. I don't think I've ever even so far paid 2,000 yen for one person's meal so far.
まあ行くとこによるけど、まあそんな感じだね。
So that's super cheap. And curry, as you mentioned, also super cheap.
これチェーンじゃない？チェーン店だとこれだけ安いよ。
For a curry?
チェーン店。
Okay, because it's a chain. But I think curries in general, like unless if you want to make it on your own, like you can make curry on your own for insanely cheap. They even have packets at the store, like for with carrots, potatoes, and onion, like for like basically $1. And then you can get a package that can get up to like 8 like large bowls of curry for about like another $1.50. So you can make like 8 meals for like $3 if you're like not counting water as an expense and heat. Which is crazy good. But the thing is, as an American, a lot of stuff that I want is expensive.
多分アメリカとか、まあ、外国で流行ってるものは高いと思う。例えばチーズとかだったり、あと
bread,
ビーフ、
bread,
パン、
beef, beans, all expensive.
ナッツ
Corn, nuts, all expensive. Let me think. What else is expensive? Yogurt. General is relatively.
ヨーグルトやまあまあ安い。
I guess it's maybe yogurt might be even. No, it depends. You can get these really big. Oh yeah, butter. Anything that's dairy based is expensive. That's why I think yogurt's probably more expensive. In the U.S., you can get these giant vats of yogurt as well as cheese, as other stuff like that. Especially if you want to get good cheese. Don't even get me started on that. I had giant blocks of sharp cheddar cheese that arrived from America sent over yesterday. Oh, it's amazing. I'm so happy to have good cheese. But if you wanted to, for one, you can't get sharp cheese really in Japan, just regardless of how much money you have. Even if you go to Tokyo, you can get slightly matured, slightly sharp cheese. But if you want to get very sharp cheese, as far as I can tell, it doesn't exist.
自分でシャープにしないとね。
Yeah, you need like ferment your own cheese. But yeah, a lot of the essentials, or I consider essentials for me as an American, are super expensive. Everything that's Japanese though, mad cheap. Like super cheap. Especially eating out. Eating out is crazy cheap.
そうね。なんかもうフルセットで海鮮丼とか、まあ1000円ぐらいで食べれる。
You know, we'll drop a picture of one of the meals or something that we've had for what is it?
値段と一緒に。
Yeah, with the price and the meal, so you can get an idea. And then yeah, thanks for the comment. That's kind of our thought on that. And let's get to the next comment here from Oddity, another MVP commenter. And actually, I'll respond to this part first and then get to the other one because I think I want to finish the episode with that. So, transport. I got really lost in Joey's rant about why good transportation is bad. Are you saying because transportation in Japan is so efficient, it somehow made Japanese people lazy because they are unwilling to cover a distance that by American standards is inconsequential? Because in the US, these distances take much longer. But if in Japan it's not customary to go to one's house, they wouldn't come regardless of distance. No. Is it not customary because living spaces in Japan are small? That's what I've heard at least. So, my apologies for being confusing in a rant. In short, when your public transport is so great that you can travel from like to Tokyo, from like anywhere you're at, if you're even close to Tokyo, it increases the chances that anybody you will meet in Tokyo because if you want to go somewhere, you have to go to Tokyo because that's where everybody goes for work. That's where all the development happens. Most cool things, if you're living around Tokyo, are in Tokyo or whatever big city, if you're Osaka, whatever. This means if you're commuting to somewhere, you're just taking like a 1-2 hour train to Tokyo. Another person who you meet in Tokyo by chance probably also took a 1 or 2 hour train to Tokyo, because most people coming into Tokyo are coming outside of Tokyo, or to some degree outside of Tokyo. So let's say I want to hang out at this person's house. That means to hang out at this person's house, I'm probably having to go 4 hours by train and then 4 hours back, which is an absurd amount. And so that was just my thinking of saying, yes, good transportation is good, but I never thought that, from my experience, it also makes it much harder to hang out at somebody's house. Now, there is an aspect of Japanese people not like going to each other's houses. Do you know why that is? I don't know if it's because it's small. Maybe people say it's small, but if Japanese people are good at making small spaces work, I'll say that.
プライベートだからじゃない。結構、プライベートと、なんていうの、まあ、外交的な交流っていうのを分けたいみたいな。
Yeah. I mean, I think people, I'll just say we've had good experience. If you ask, as long as you're not going to their house and you're the one inviting them to yours, we haven't had any issues. So I don't know how, maybe it's like the generational gap thing too, where they're just not used to doing it. But the second you do it, you're like, wow, this makes sense. And the reason it makes sense is, like I said, you have to pay there are no spaces that you can basically pay, or that you can be in for free in Japan, basically. Like, I have a lot of local game stores I really like going to, and you can just sit down and play for free. It doesn't really exist. You have to, if you're in a space, you have to be paying to be in a space. So when I hang out with my friends in the US, nobody pays money. Everybody lives close to each other because, like I said, transport is shit. So commuting isn't as often. So it means if you meet somebody and become friends with them, hey, they probably live really close to you because they didn't commute 2 hours away to get to where you're at. They just biked or walked, or America, they took a car. But they probably only took like 15 minutes. And so that was kind of my point. It was a weird, unintuitive thing that I felt in Japan, where probably part of it is because of it customary not to go to people's houses. But the other part of it is that when your transportation is great, people are going to use it. And by people using it, that means if you're flipping a coin and you're meeting a random person, that person's more likely to not be from where you're at than to be from there, which means that your house distance between their house distance, you guys are probably really far away from each other. And whereas in America, because transport sucks, if you're seeing somebody, that means that they're probably somewhere close to wherever they got to this destination by car. And that means you're also probably close. So instead of a 4 hour train, it's probably a 15-minute, maybe 20-minute car ride. And so that was kind of something I thought about, which may or may not be true, but it was a thought I had. Anyways, in the longer thing I wanted to respond to was comment about learning Japanese kanji specifically, and a issue you've been having. So I'm learning Japanese on my own, so it took me a while to figure out things. I started with reading guides which explained about kanji, kunyomi, and onyomi, but it all seemed too abstract. I settled on Genki 1 and it was fine, only it didn't seem to teach any kanji. To my horror, I discovered I was supposed to be learning all this kanji and writing the entire time. Now there's this annoying gap between my vocab grammar and comprehension skills and my reading skills. I've picked up a fair amount of kanji by repeatedly encountering them, and I add words to Anki with the kanji and jukungo breakdown. I tried a bit of wani-kani and kanji damage, but it's just learning words out of context, and that's on top of the vocab I add from mining anime in your podcast. It's too much. Is it important to learn how to write kanji? How important is it to learn radicals? So, as a Japanese, I'm not sure if you have thoughts on this, but as a person learning Japanese myself, and who's can sympathize with what you're going through, I have advice. And my advice is, so if you want to learn kanji, which I highly recommend learning kanji, and you realize that your comprehension is better than everything else, I wouldn't worry too much about that. But at the same point, you're going to have to learn kanji at some point to learn kanji. And so I would say, especially if you're using Anki, you can actually set limits on how many cards you are forced to review in a day, or even able to add. And so I'd look into that. And I just say, cap yourself with how much vocab, how much kanji, whatever you actually want to be reviewing. Especially because if you let that get really long, or you find it unfun to do, you're just not going to want to engage with the language in general, because it's going to make you think about having to put cards in. Like, I'm kind of very similar to there's a polyglot called Steve Kaufman, in my perspective, kind of language learning. If it's fun and you like it, do it. If it's not fun, you don't like it, don't do it. You don't like using Anki, you don't like using vocabs, don't do that. But if you want to learn kanji, and I mean, which I do think you should learn because you can't read without it, or it makes even speaking difficult because people use kanji in references. There's so many kanjis referenced all the time. In people's names, which you encounter obviously all the time. So if you don't know kanji or the meaning behind the kanji, you're probably going to get a lot of, but yeah, my thing would be to prevent yourself being overwhelmed by setting limits, or either artificially or straight up through your apps that you're using. And with the other thing, how important it is to write kanji and how important it is to learn radicals. My opinion on how important it is to write kanji is it depends. I have a, let me see if I put my self notes here, or maybe whatever, I'll go off the top of my head from what I remember them being. But so the benefits to writing kanji are, as I see it, it helps you remember, like if you enjoy doing it, it can help you remember kanji better when you're reading it because you're using another sense. You're not only reading them or seeing them as you're writing them, which is what you're doing when you're memorizing with flashcards, but you're also using you're physically doing it, and you have the motor connection. And I'm pretty sure there have been many studies that show that, yeah, the more connections you have, the more like a deeper, what's it called? Neural networks, bonds or paths. You can create. And so that's one benefit. Second benefit is more practical. It is very not people. Japanese speakers do this all the time. You'll see them very commonly air write kanji, and when trying to describe either their name, what kanji their name uses, what you're looking for, they'll say it's this location, and they'll say, oh, what kanji, because Japanese is messed up and the pronunciation doesn't tell you what kanji it is a lot of times, and they'll air write. Minor helpful thing. More helpful thing, it's very, I'd say like writing, if you are interested at all in doing like more personalized things, like writing birthday notes or writing messages to like let's say you're doing a host stay or something, or a friend or whatever, I think it's helpful learning how to write. Another benefit of writing is if you ever wanted in the future, obviously to, work in Japan. Well, I don't think you need to write, I don't think you need to write by hand. But Japan's still a very paper-based society in a lot of jobs, and so there's a good chance that, like for example, even getting like your yearly pass or monthly pass for a what's it called? Yeah, changing your address, going to, there's something called the yakuba, which is like the provincial office that you have to do anything to get anything done. You need to write, unless you want to pay somebody else to do that for you. It's all handwritten. And things change quickly in Japan, but a lot of systems change slowly, and everything is still very paper based. But
radicals って何?
Radicals are like, you know, kanji. No, not kakijun, which is order. But they're the hen, the like, you know, mizu, or like the hito. Like the parts of
sanzui とか.
Yeah, sanzui.
hen とかか.
Yes, exactly. I think that you will pick them up naturally over time, as you did mention in your email, which I took on. I think if you think it's helpful, then you can do it. But I do think what you read, it was in your email, which I admitted, I do believe that you will naturally pick them up and see patterns, and you'll form them. That's how I did it. I sort of looked at some of the radicals, but if looking at radicals, memorizing them isn't enjoyable to you, then I wouldn't do it. It's just boring. But you will pick them up. You'll see them plenty of times. And I will say that Japanese people do refer to them. I noticed that you refer to like sanzui, which is like yeah, and so it can be helpful in that sense. It does help you like cheat code meaning for a lot of kanjis, not a lot of them. So there's that benefit. But like I think with kanji, which like the more kanji you learn and the more comfortable you get with learning kanji, for me, I actually just prefer kanji over hiragana. I prefer kanji over katakana. I see kanji, and to me, it's more clarity and meaning, and I don't have to, unless it's somebody's name. Unless it's somebody's name, it gives me an aneurysm. But if it's not somebody's name, I'm like, okay, I know how to read this. I know how this flows in terms of reading in a sentence. Everything is great. And so when I learn new kanji, I don't have to write them anymore. Although I'll do the air writing thing, just as like air practice. But I don't worry too much about knowing how to write them because although I tried, I mentioned in the middle section to keep up a journal or whatever, and just so I feel comfortable writing Japanese if I need to do it. It's not a very pressing thing. Most Japanese people, especially younger people, text like exclusively, and I mean for like everything or like on like type on the computer. But I think you're a little different because you still have to. You're like, for being in med school, a lot of it's handwritten. But like coding, for example, think about that. You don't have to write Japanese. So I'm assuming your ability to reproduce handwritten Japanese is probably much higher than the average Japanese person nowadays. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to and directly talked to native Japanese speakers who stumbled on Japanese, like, what was it? This was assistant teacher of Japanese, my professor, who's from Japan, literally just came for the year, and they blanked on like a kanji I learned in the 101. Like it was what was it? It wasn't Genki. It was something like, Genki no Gen. It was something as simple as that, basically. And I was like, damn, this is like when if you don't use it, you lose it. And I feel like writing kanji is becoming less and less important, but it's really cool. You know what I'm saying? If you want to know calligraphy, you want to do stuff, it opens up more gates than doesn't. And if you find a way to put it into your learning strategy, you can actually learn more efficiently. And then as a byproduct, actually know how to write some kanji. So, unless you have any other thoughts on that.
まあ、書き方を覚えたいなら、まあ、例えば暗記カードが出た時に、読みだけ出して、で、どうやって書くんだろうって、まあ、エアライティングでもいいし、頭の中にイメージしてもいいし、そのプロセスを何回もやれば覚えられると。
Yeah, I will say that quick thing on stroke order. I think it's actually helpful to remember with stroke order, or if you're remembering kanji with stroke order, because kanji, as you know, are made up of components. And once you learn the general stroke orders, and you don't have to, you just look at it and you do it and you follow it, you'll realize that you can memorize things in chunks a lot better. Like anytime you see a little square, it's written the exact same, and like 99.9% of kanji. And I think it allows for chunking and memorizing like that a lot easier. You don't have to learn stroke order for new kanji. Like once you learn a certain amount, you know, if it's a square, you write it like this. If it's like hito, you write it like that. And you basically just put in these blocks of things you've already memorized from a very small set of kanji together. And so I think it just helps with learning more efficiently to learn with stroke order. It just it makes it so you don't have to think. You don't have to be like this time, how do I want to write the square? This time, how do I write this thing? You're like, this is how you write squares. You write squares like this.
パターンがあるから。
Yeah. That bell means we've reached the end of today's episode. Thanks for joining us in another lazy conversation towards fluency. If you have any language-related questions and or just looking for general advice, send an email to lazyfluency@gmail.com. Also, make sure to check out our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and more. We'd appreciate the support. This has been Joey
and Ayami
signing off. じゃあねー。